Hello, again, I am back and I am going to read the section King George V, and we are still talking about the Great War. So, and in this, the topic is number 8, and it is entitled Defending the Generals. So, I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we can proceed. Exactly like a skinny Duke of York, the image of him. One of the Queen Victoria's ladies wrote of the Tsar Nicholas II when he visited Balmoral in 1896. He had more than a physical resemblance united the future King George V and his Russian cousin, the son of Queen Alexandra's sister. Although they met on only fitfully when the dynasties of Europe gathered to celebrate or to mourn, their affection for each other was genuine enough. From St. Petersburg, where in 1894 the Duke of York was attending the marriage of Nicholas to another of his cousins, Prince Alex of Hesse. He wrote to Queen Victoria, "Nicky has been kindness in itself to me. He is the same dear boy he has always been to me, and he talks to me quite openly on every subject." The young Tsar's goodwill survived even his visit to Balmoral, where in the freezing rain he shot not a single stag and only one brace of grouse. Yet he laughed at £1,000 to be divided among the Queen's servants. Throughout the diplomatic friction caused by Russia's designs on Persia and Afghanistan, the friendship of king and Tsar never faltered. They talked for the last time in 1913, when both were guests of the Kaiser in Berlin, but for the next 4 years continued to exchange messages of trust and encouragement. It was therefore with acute anxiety that on 13 March 1917, the king wrote in his diary, "Bad news from Russia. Practically a revolution has broken out in Petrograd, the name which St. Peter had been known since 1914. And some of the guards and regiments have mutinied and killed their officers. This rising is against the government, not against the Tsar." 2 days later, he heard from Sir George Buchanan, the British ambassador in Petrograd, that Nicholas had been forced to sign his abdication. "I am in despair," wrote his cousin. "The cause of this downfall. It does not belong to this story. Lloyd George's epitome will suffice." Virtuous and well-meaning, the sovereign became directly responsible for a regime drenched in corruption, indolence, debauchery, favoritism, jealousy, sycophancy, idolatry, incompetence, and treachery, an accumulation of all those vices that make utter misgovernment and inevitably an end in this and inevitably end in anarchy. Both the king and prime minister reacted impulsively to news of Tsar's abdication. The king dispatched this sympathetic telegram: "Events of last week have been deeply distressed me. My thoughts are constantly with you, and I shall always remain your true and devoted friend, as you know I have been in the past." Nicholas was, in fact, denied his cousin's consolation. The provisional government, which at the time was anxious to protect the ex-Tsar's life, withheld the message lest it should provoke revolutionary violence against him. Lloyd George's sympathies were more for the new regime than for its principal victim. He addressed a fulsome telegram to Prince Love, head of the provisional government in Russia, declaring that the revolution whereby the people have placed their destinies on the sure foundation of freedom is the greatest service which they have yet made to the cause for which the Allied peoples have been fighting since August 1914. It reveals the fundamental truth that this war is at bottom a struggle for popular government as well as for liberty. The king was displeased by the tone of the message, which he found a little strong. Stanfordham complained to Lloyd George that the word revolution had a disagreeable sound coming from a monarchical government. But as usual, the Prime Minister had the last word. He good-humoredly replied that the present British monarchy was founded upon a revolution, which Stanfordham could not deny. In contrasting attitudes of the king and prime minister lay the seeds of a persistent myth that it was the king who strove to rescue his cousin from the perils of the Russian Revolution, only to be thwarted by a heartless and opportunist Lloyd George. The late Lord Mountbatten, with all the authority of his close kinship and apparent omniscience, gave currency to the legend. As nephew of the Tsar, his mother and the Russian Empress were sisters. He continued to proclaim almost to the end of his life that Lloyd George's hands were stained with the blood of the imperial family. Correspondence between the king and his ministers in March and April 1917 reveals a different chain of events leading to the murder of the Tsar and his family 15 months later. It shows that the British government would willingly have offered them asylum, but for the fears expressed by Buckingham Palace and that at the most critical moment in their fortunes they were deserted by a radical prime minister seeking to appease his supporters, but by their ever affectionate cousin Georgie. The first suggestion that the imperial family should come to England was made by Pavel Milukov, the foreign minister of the provisional government, on 19 March 1917. Sir George Buchanan at once reported it to the Foreign Office in London. Even before they had the time to consider, a second telegram arrived from Petrograd. Milukov's inquiry about asylum Milukov's inquiry about asylum for the Tsar now took the form of a request. To this, the Foreign Office sent a guarded reply. The British government would be glad to see the Tsar leave Russia, but wondered whether Denmark or Switzerland would not be a more suitable place for the residents. This in turn provoked a more urgent message from Petrograd. Buchanan reported to London that Milukov was most anxious to get the emperor out of Russia as soon as possible. The extremists have excited opinion against His Majesty. The ambassador concluded, I earnestly trust that, in spite of the obvious objections, I may be authorized without delay to offer His Majesty asylum in England, and at the same time assure the Russian government that he will remain there during the war. On 22 March, Lloyd George invited Stanfordham to Downing Street to discuss the Tsar's future. There, they were joined by Bonar Law and Harding, who, on seizing the Viceroy of India, had become permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office. It was generally agreed, Stamfordham wrote in his minutes of the meeting, that the proposal that we should receive the emperor in this country, having come from the Russian government, which we are endeavoring with all our powers to support, could not be refused. The king's private secretary then raised a more practical problem. How would the Tsar and his family support themselves in exile? When the prime minister suggested that the king should place a house at their disposal, Stamfordham replied that only Balmoral was available, which would certainly not be a suitable residence at this time of the year. The meeting concluded that Buchanan, in formally offering asylum to the Tsar, should ask the Russian government to provide enough funds for him to live in suitable dignity. Buchanan's message that Britain was prepared to receive the imperial family evoked no immediate response from the Russian government. Although anxious to be rid of the Tsar, they dreaded the anger of the extremists if any attempt were made to remove him to safety. Mylikoff did not reject the British offer for which he had so urgently pleaded only 2 days earlier. Yet he made no effort to accept it. The delay proved fatal. It allowed those Russians who sought revenge on the fallen Tsar to consolidate their strength, and it prompted the king to have second thoughts about his cousin's future. The change of mind was reflected in a letter from Stamfordham to Balfour, the Foreign Secretary, on March 30th, 8 days after the meeting at Downing Street. The king has been thinking much about the government's proposal that the Emperor Nicholas and his family should come to England. As you are doubtless aware, the king has a strong personal friendship for the emperor and therefore would be glad to do anything to help him in his crisis. But his majesty cannot help doubting, not only on account of the dangers of the voyage, but on general grounds of expediency, whether it is advisable that the imperial family should take up their residence in this country. The king would be glad if you would consult the prime minister, as his majesty understands that no definite decisions have yet to come on the subject by the Russian government. Balfour replied on the 2nd of April. After patiently recounting the exchange of telegrams with Petrograd that had led to the government's decision, he ended, His Majesty's ministers quite realize the difficulties to which you refer in your letter, but they do not think, unless the position changes, that it is now possible to withdraw the invitation which has been sent. They therefore trust that the king will consent to adhere to the original invitation, which was sent on the advice of His Majesty's ministers. The Foreign Secretary's rebuff, it drew a frosty acknowledgment from Stamfordham. His Majesty must regard the matter as settled, he wrote, unless the Russian government should come to any fresh decision on the subject. Stamfordham's acquiescence lasted no more than 48 hours. On 5 April, the King's daily box of Foreign Office papers included a telegram from Buchanan seeking permission for 2 cousins of the Tsar to come to London. Stamfordham thereupon wrote to Sir Eric Drummond, Balfour's private secretary, As entirely my own personal view, I do trust the whole question of the Emperor and Empress of Russia's coming to England, and also that of the proposal now made that the Grand Dukes George and Michael should do the same, will be reconsidered. It will be very hard on the king and arouse much public comment, if not resentment. 24 hours later, this warning shot was followed by a heavy salvo directed at the Foreign Secretary himself. With all the authority of the sovereign, Stamfordham wrote to Balfour, "Every day the king is becoming more concerned about the question of the emperor and empress coming to this country. His Majesty receives letters from people in all classes of life, known or unknown to him, saying how much the matter is being discussed, not only in clubs but in working men, and that Labour members in the House of Commons are expressing adverse opinions to the proposal. As you know, from the first, the king has thought the presence of the imperial family, especially the empress, in this country will raise all sorts of difficulties. And I feel sure that you appreciate how awkward it will be for our royal family, who are closely connected both with the emperor and the empress. You probably also are aware that the subject has become more or less public property, and that people are either assuming that it has been initiated by the king or deprecating that the very unfair position in which His Majesty will be placed if the arrangement is carried out. The king desires me to ask you whether, after consulting the Prime Minister, Sir George Buchanan should not be communicated with a view to approaching the Russian government to make some other plan for the future residence of their Imperial Majesties." The king must have felt that the letter lacked emphasis. For that same evening, Stamfordham was instructed to write again to Balfour in more peremptory terms. "He must beg you to represent the Prime Minister that from all he hears and reads in the press, the residence in our country of the ex-Emperor and Empress would be strongly resented by the public, and would undoubtedly compromise the position of the King and Queen. Buchanan ought to be instructed to tell Milikoff that the opposition to the Emperor and Empress coming here is so strong that we must be allowed to withdraw from the consent previously given to the Russian government's proposal." Under such sustained bombardment, the Foreign Secretary's resolution faltered. That night, he sent a minute to the Prime Minister. "I think the king is placed in an awkward position. If the Tsar is to come here, we are bound publicly to state that we, the government, have invited him, and to add, for our own protection, that we did so on the initiative of the Russian government, who will not like it. I still think that we may have to suggest Spain or the south of France as a more suitable residence than England for the Tsar." Stamfordham followed up his successful assault on the Foreign Office with a dissent on Downing Street 4 days later. He told the Prime Minister the protests received by the king, both anonymous and from friends, against the proposed arrival in London of the Tsar and his family. And he reminded Lloyd George of the similar abuse to which the king had been exposed after receiving members of the supposedly pro-German Greek royal family. He continued that even if the government accepted responsibility, the people would reply that this was done to screen the king. To illustrate the point, Stamfordham flourished a copy of the radical paper Justice, containing an article by the socialist H. M. Heinemann on the disastrous consequences of the Tsar's presence in England. The Prime Minister admitted the force of these arguments and promised to consult the French government in the hope that the Tsar might be invited to make his home in France. The king's campaign to deny asylum to his cousin was going well. But Stamfordham had not yet finished with Balfour. Having read in the telegram from Petrograd that Mylokov still expected the Tsar to travel to England after certain obstacles had been cleared, he spoke firmly to the Foreign Secretary. He told Balfour that after what the king had written to him, His Majesty expected that Buchanan would by now have been informed that the previous agreement to admit the Tsar could no longer be held as binding. Balfour meekly proposed to draft a telegram to Petrograd that very afternoon. By now, the prospect of the Tsar's residence in London had become no less embarrassing to the British government than to the king, although for different reasons. The king feared for his popularity, even for his throne. The government wished for a close understanding with Russia's new rulers and their continuance as military allies. Neither spared much thought for the deposed Tsar and his family. Both arguments were set out in the Foreign Secretary's telegram to Buchanan, which concluded by instructing him to say nothing further to Mylokov on the subject unless the Russians themselves raised the question. "40 years later, the ambassador's daughter, Miss Muriel Buchanan, was at pains to refute accusations that her father had made no effort to save the imperial family, and that he must bear a share of the blame for their ultimate fate. The ambassador's reply to Balfour's telegram on 13 April does nothing to support her case. "I entirely share your view," he began, "that if there is any danger of an anti-monarchist movement, it would be far better that the ex-emperor should not come to England." He was confirmed in this. The telegram to London continued. After talking to the Labour MP, Will Thorne, a member of a fraternal delegation to Petrograd, Buchanan attached less importance to Balfour's contention that the Tsar's presence in England would damage relations between the British and Russian governments. He agreed, however, that the extreme left in Russia, as well as German agents, would be sure to stir up public opinion against Britain. Buchanan's telegram ends with this disingenuous sentiment: "If only the French government would consent, it would be far better for our point of view that the emperor should go to France. Perhaps it would be well to sound them on the subject, and in the event of their consenting, I might well tell the Minister for Foreign Affairs that the revolution, which had been welcomed with such enthusiasm in England, had so indisposed the British public against the old regime, and that the presence of the emperor in England might provoke demonstrations that would cause serious embarrassment." The king's volte-face was complete. With the concurrence of his ministers, he ensured that, whatever else might happen to his Russian cousins, they would not set foot in England. The original offer of asylum, to which both sovereign and prime minister had subscribed, was a dead letter. For their part, the Russian government still hoped to be rid of the Tsar, although under increasing pressure from extremists not to allow him his freedom. But as the weeks slipped by, their tentative inquiries about British plans for the journey were met by a bland immobility. In July, Kerensky replaced Prince Love as a liberal-minded but powerless prime minister, soon to be overthrown by Bolsheviks, Lenin, and Trotsky. The imperial family had meanwhile been moved from the palace of Sarkov Selo near Petrograd to Tobolsk, a distant Siberia. In April 1918, the Tsar, his wife, and his children were taken to even more inaccessible town of Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. There, 3 months later, they were done to death. How far was the king responsible for their ultimate fate? Had he at once urged the Prime Minister to send a British cruiser to the Baltic? The provisional government might have seized the chance to bundle the imperial family on board and be well rid of them. Against this, it may be argued that Mylakov and Kerensky, for all their humane intentions, lacked the strength to defy those extremists who sought revenge. In any case, the Tsar's children were suffering from measles, and their parents might well have pleaded for delay. What does remain certain is that the king, by persuading his government to withdraw their original offer of asylum, deprived the imperial family of their best, perhaps their only means of escape. In retrospect, the king refused to help his Russian cousin, seeming wholly out of character. It became intelligible only in context of an England burdened by war weariness and discontent. The first principle of a hereditary monarch is to survive, and never was King George V obliged to tread the path of self-preservation more cautiously than in 1917. He felt himself doubly menaced by a whispering campaign that doubted his narrow patriotism, and by an upsurge of republicanism. At such a time of insecurity, his government urged him to endorse their offer of sanctuary to the imperial family, a gesture that would have identified him with Tsarist autocracy and imperiled his own repute as a constitutional monarch. Kings are more sensitive to the specter of revolution at home than abroad, and in March 1917, George V failed to foresee the descent of Russia into the Bolshevik barbarianism. He was not more obtuse than his prime minister. The king particularly feared the consequences of inviting the Tsar's wife to England, holding her largely responsible for the present state of chaos that exists in Russia. Lord Bertie, asked by Harding whether the French government might accept the imperial family, put it more harshly. He stated, "I do not think that the ex-emperor and his family would be welcome in France. The Empress is not only a Boche by birth, but in sentiment. She did all she could to bring about an understanding with Germany. She is regarded as a criminal or a criminal lunatic, and the ex-emperor as a criminal from his weakness in submission to her promptings." Whatever the regrets the king may have felt at abandoning Cousin Nicky during those first few weeks of revolution, his compassion did not extend to that discredited consort. Stamfordham's part in these events can scarcely be exaggerated. He determined that whoever else might suffer, it should not be his matter. That was the single end which he pursued with relentless vigor and ultimate success. Nor did his efforts to protect the king from any damaging taint of Russian imperialism cease with the murder of the Tsar and his family at Ekaterinburg 16 months later. When the first reports reached London, the Grand Duchess George organized a memorial service. Stamfordham later told the Foreign Secretary that in normal circumstances, the king would either attend or be represented. He continued, "On the other hand, public opinion is a hypersensitive condition, and it might misconstrue anything done by the king into sympathy with the counter-revolution in Russia. Meanwhile, it seems to me we could decline to join the Duchess George's service on the grounds that the government have no official news of the emperor's death." The king spurned such deception. On July 25, 1918, he wrote in his diary, "May and I attended a service at the Russian church in Welbeck Street in memory of our dear Nicky, who I fear was shot last month by Bolsheviks. We can get no details. It was a foul murder. I was devoted to Nicky, who was the kindest of men and a thorough gentleman. He loved his country and his people." A month later, he wrote, "I hear from Russia that there is every probability that Aliki and 4 daughters and a little boy were murdered at the same time as Nicky. It's too horrible, and it shows what fiends these Bolsheviks are. For poor Aliki, perhaps it was best so, but those poor innocent children." The king mourned his cousin and abused their murderers. Yet there is no record of his having expressed sorrow, much less contrition, at his own role in the tragedy. It was as if those agitated letters to Balfour have never been written, those appeals to Lloyd George never made. There is a possible explanation of this apparent insensitivity. On 4 June 1917, 2 months before the Tsar was removed to Tobolsk, the king wrote to his retired private secretary Knowles, "I own that I feel very anxious for the safety of the emperor. If he once gets inside the walls of the prisons of St. Peter and St. Paul, I doubt he will ever come out alive." Having belatedly realized the danger to which his cousin was now exposed, he may have instigated or at least encouraged the British Secret Service to rescue them by bribery or by force. The planning of such a scheme, although in the end it came to nothing, would have taken the will for the deed, stilled the king's uneasy conscience, and it enabled him to recall his conduct towards the Tsar without guilt. All this is mere conjecture. There's no evidence that exists that the king, with those abortive plans known to have been made by Russian refugees for the rescue of their ex-ruler. Yet it is significant that the royal archives at Windsor contain hardly any documents dealing with the imprisonment of the imperial family between April 1917 and May 1918, precisely those months during which rescue must have been considered, if not planned. The absence of such papers points less to the abandonment of the Tsar by the king than to an exceptional need for secrecy. For until March 1918, when Russia made peace with Germany at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the British government hoped to retain Russia as a military ally. Hence the need to conceal from her any British interest in releasing the Tsar from revolutionary control. It is a tenuous theory, yet not implausible. Stamford Ham's amnesia remained as complete as the king's. He felt no responsibility for the fate of the Romanovs. In July 1918, 3 days after suggesting that it might be imprudent for the king to attend a public memorial service to his cousin, he wrote to congratulate Escher on a newspaper tribute to the dead Tsar. King George wrote, "Was there ever a crueler murder? And has this country ever before displayed such a callous indifference to a tragedy of this magnitude? What does it all mean? I am so thankful that the King and Queen attended the memorial service." Oh, I have not yet discovered that the PM or the S of S for FA, or even represented. Where is our national sympathy, gratitude, our common decency gone to? What were the sufferings of that poor unfortunate emperor during the past year? Why didn't the German emperor make the release of the Tsar and family a condition of the Brest-Litovsk peace? The irony of Escher's reply can not have been intentional. If this country had been led by the Duke of Wellington or Lord Beaconsfield, the unfortunate royal family would have been in safety at Claremont. You ask why the German emperor did not make the release of the Tsar a condition of Brest-Litovsk treaty? I should suppose for the same reason that prevented our government from obtaining the Tsar's release from Milikov. It was moral cowardice. It was fear of insinuation, fear of criticism, and fear of abuse. Stamfordham did not trouble to correct Escher's distorted version of events. By now, it may be presumed, he himself had come to believe in the myth. The secret of the king's involvement in the negotiations of 1917 was well kept. Lloyd George honorably refused to justify his apparent abandonment of the Tsar by revealing the pressures which the king's private secretary had brought to bear on the government. In 1934, however, 3 years after Stamfordham's death, it became known that Lloyd George was writing his wartime memoirs. According to custom, the government of the day asked the cabinet secretary, Maurice Hankey, to decide how far the former prime minister could quote from official documents. Hankey recommended that the chapter on the future residence of the deposed Tsar should be suppressed altogether. Lloyd George's secretary wrote of Hankey in his diary. Some parts of it made him feel that it would be premature to publish. For instance, the reference to the anti-monarchical movement that was developed in England at the time. Hankey thought that the king would object to this and to the extract from the cabinet minutes of the subject. Lloyd George did not welcome Hankey's criticism and complained that the court were very jumpy and nervy. 2 months later, he changed his mind, scrapped the original chapter, and wrote a new one containing no reference to either the king or Stamfordham. Here, its crucial passage: an agitation had also started in this country, which indicated that there was a strong feeling in extensive working-class circles hostile to the Tsar coming to Great Britain. However, the invitation was not withdrawn. The ultimate issue in the matter was decided by the actions of the Russian government, which continued to place obstacles in the way of the Tsar's departure. That is not a strictly true account of events, but it did save the king's honor. And that is the end of that topic. So, and that's what we know about the Tsar and how he was not able to come to England. You know, I think there was a lot of back and forth going on with that. So, and I will take a break and meet you in the next episode. Thank you for listening.